Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to this new tutorial series in which we're going to have a look at Cherry Audio's Elka X, an emulation of the Synth X from 1981. Can I interest anyone in a little jar? What a sound this thing is. This is the laser harp from Rendezvous. It's just absolutely amazing. That's how to do a bluff. I kid you not, I've sat here with that low C pressed for about a minute, just going, oh, that's really, really nice. That was really, really nice. I'm absolutely loving this synth. Anyway, we're going to pull it to bits, figure out how it works. First thing that we're going to do today is have a look at the oscillators. If you like this video series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Okay, having had that lovely sound to whet the appetite, I'm going to throw it all away by pressing the new button, which basically initializes the synthesizer to its default state. It's going to sound a little bit odd. When I press a key now, you'll hear something slightly strange about the sound. Here we go. That kind of washing sound is called a unison detune. What's going on is that you've got two oscillators running here. Oscillators 1 and 2 are both playing almost exactly the same note, but if you look very carefully, oscillator 2 is very slightly detuned by 1.5 cents, and in fact that's the default. If I change this tuning, I'm going to press the Alt key and click the knob. That's how we reset a knob to its default state, and you'll see it goes back to 1.5 cents. The main oscillator is at 0, and so that very, very slight difference is making these two oscillators be slightly out of tune. And that's where we're getting this pitched, this waving pitch. You can see it on the oscilloscope, and very, very slight. I mean, like 0.01 of a hertz is what's causing that waving sound. So that's what we're getting. Now, I want to simplify this synthesizer right down to absolute bare minimum so that I can show you how the oscillators work. So I'm going to turn one of these two oscillators off. For reasons that will become apparent a little bit later, I'm actually going to turn oscillator 1 off. Now we've just got a single oscillator. And now, as you can see, the tone is absolutely rock solid. 65.52 Hz is very slightly above C2 because of this 1.5 cents detune. So we've got oscillator 2 isolated now, and we can concentrate on exactly what it's doing. Well, these octave buttons on the left-hand side, they're measured in feet, which is an old throwback to the days of church organs with the enormous pipes. Basically, every time we click one of these buttons, the higher one up is going to go up an octave. And then we can transpose in semitones. And then we have fine control over the tuning. So we go up to 25 cents, which is half a semitone. It's basically halfway between C and C sharp. Once again, click my Alt button and I'm back to its default, which isn't exactly 0. Then we've got some different waveforms to play with. The first 4 buttons are relatively straightforward. Triangle, saw, square and pulse are the 4 most common types of waveform that you'll see. Triangle is the smoothest. It's quite quiet, that, but you can see in the oscilloscope as well exactly why it's called a triangle wave. Sawtooth is the harshest, because it contains an even distribution, or a more even distribution, of all the various harmonics. You can see them all, and when you add all of the harmonics together, you get that kind of brash sound. Sawtooths are great for subtractive synthesis, subtractive filtering. We'll have a look at that later when we come to look at the filter sections. Square wave is similar in many ways to a triangle, but it's got more of those upper overtones, so it's a harsher sound than the triangle. Again, from the oscilloscope, it's pretty obvious why it's called a square wave. It's not perfectly square, though. Notice this is an analog synthesizer. It's worthwhile actually taking a moment just to discuss the difference between voltage-controlled oscillators, which is how analog synthesizers originally appeared. This is a digitally controlled oscillator. That doesn't mean it's a digital synthesizer. It means there are digital chips controlling the pitch, the tuning of the oscillators. So with the old classical VCOs, you would get pitch drift if the thing warmed up, like a classic Moog, for instance. When the instrument warmed up, all of the oscillators would go slightly out of tune, and it was a nightmare to keep in tune. Particularly difficult if you want to play a polyphonic synthesizer because all of those notes are going slightly out of tune at different rates. More or less impossible to play a chord in those situations. So in the late 70s, the early 80s, this concept of the digitally controlled oscillator was developed, whereby all of the synthesis underneath was still completely analog and you get that beautiful warmth. It's just the timing of the oscillators, in other words, the pitch of the oscillators, is controlled with a very fast clock, which means that the pitches are very, very accurate. Right, science lesson over. Next one along is the pulse wave. A square wave is a pulse wave with a duty cycle of 50%, which means it's up exactly the same amount of time as it's down. Have a look at this distance here is the duty cycle, and the distance between this up period is the same as the distance of the down period. That's not the case for a pulse unless the pulse width is set to 0. So at the moment that's exactly the same as a square wave. Now I'm going to change the pulse width and you'll see that duty cycle alter. Very classic analog synth controls all of these. You'll see pulse width modulation, which is what this pulse width, we're modulating the pulse width, PWM. You'll see this on many analog synthesizers. One thing that you won't often see on an analog synthesizer is a pulse width that can get you all the way to silence. If I press a key, turn the pulse width all the way up, the sound disappears. Usually analog synthesizers cap the pulse width off to prevent it getting all the way to 100%. What's basically happening here, to bring it back a tiny amount, you can see in order to hear sound, there has to be a variance of control voltage. That control voltage is basically being translated into a pressure on the speaker cone, which is making air vibrate, which is appearing in our ears and we're hearing it. If that pressure is absolutely constant 100% at the time, then there's no variance in the air pressure and you don't hear any sound. And that's what happens when we turn the pulse width all the way up. It completely disappears. We need to have some difference between up and down in order for us to hear the tone. It's a really nasal, kind of nasty, brittle sound when the pulse width is almost at maximum. Finally, over on the right hand side, the volume knob, pretty self-explanatory. You'll also note that I've very cunningly jumped over 2 of the buttons because they're more complicated. Let's jump back now and have a look at them. Well, I've just introduced you to the concept of PWM, which is pulse width modulation, but this button is something different. Ordinarily, pulse width is operating very slowly. If you watch the speed that my fingers are going backwards and forwards there, it's maybe once every 2 or 3 seconds. If that was happening 200 times a second or 100 times a second, you'd have a completely different effect. And that's what happens when we turn this button on here. What's happening here is that the synthesizer is still generating a pulse wave, but now instead of the pulse width being controlled by this knob, it's being controlled by Oscillator 1. Oscillator 1, whatever control voltage it happens to be outputting, is going to determine the pulse width of Oscillator 2. But what's going to happen is that you're going to get a very dramatic tonal effect entirely informed by Oscillator 1. So I'll press a key. Let's get it so that I can talk over the top of it. And now I'm going to change some of the features of Oscillator 1, for instance, the different waveforms. Transpose. Everything is C. All of those sounds that you just heard, you can see that the tuner is consistently outputting a C. So we're not changing the pitch of the tone, we're changing the shape of it inside each one of those duty cycles. But Oscillator 1 is performing such brutality on that shape that you're hearing kind of some of the essence of the oscillator come through. Let's try and get it to a stage where it's a little bit more musical than that. There you go, a sound 9 Inch Nails will be proud of. Ring mod is a different beast entirely. You'll see when I press this button, we've actually got 2 lights on here. So ring mod is a modulation on top of the existing oscillator. It's not a waveform in its own right. So let's start off with a simple setup and I'll try to demonstrate what's going on here. I'm going to set triangle wave on both oscillators. Don't forget, oscillator 1 is still turned down. You are not hearing it, but it's going to have an influence on oscillator 2 via this ring modulator. Without ring mod on, a really simple soft triangle wave, that's oscillator 2 all on its own. Now I'm going to turn ring modulation on. Now what's happened is that the output from oscillator 1, whatever its control voltage is going to be, in other words, whatever its waveform happens to be at any instantaneous moment in time, is going to be multiplied with the output from oscillator 2. That generates an effect called sum and difference. Basically, without going into the maths, and I don't really understand it myself, the simple way to understand ring modulation is to add the two pitches of the waveforms together and also subtract the two pitches from each other. So if you've got oscillators at 100 Hertz and 60 Hertz, you're going to get two new outputs, one at 160 and one at 40. You're going to throw the original waveforms away. That's the important thing with ring modulation. You abandon the original waveforms and you're just left with the difference, the sum and the difference. What this means is that you get very atonal effects. Now, without making any changes at all to the oscillator, you're going to hear almost no sound, because basically the two oscillators are cancelling each other out. But the moment I increase the pitch of oscillator 1, which we still can't hear, but its waveform is being multiplied by oscillator 2, you're going to get a classic ring modulation sound. Here we go. And if we change the waveforms of the two oscillators, let's put a sawtooth in the background. Now we get this quite atonal, brash, metallic, ringing noise. You hear lots of different adjectives used to describe ring modulation. It's deliberately atonal because fundamentals are being thrown away. Have a look in the output of Insight down below. You'll see some of the waveforms entirely missing. You get these big holes in the frequency curve where waves are cancelling each other out, and you also get new peaks being introduced which are mathematically related to each other but not harmonically. Ring modulation is all about generating n-harmonic tones. That sounds pretty cool. It's a really musical ring modulation, nasty and great at the same time. Right, I've made lots of changes to those oscillators. I'm going to throw all of those changes away just by pressing the new button again, and we're back to our default position. Both oscillators are on, both set to their default values. I want to spend some time looking at the controls in this box here because they're related to the oscillators as well. At the moment we're in polyphonic mode, which means after I've turned the volume down because I'm going to be pressing a chord, we hear all three notes. So that's three independent notes being generated by two different oscillators at the same time. Which is why we get that unison detune effect. You can see the pitch just varying very slightly, but 0.01 of a hertz. If I put it in monophonic mode, now press the chord again, holding all three keys down, you can see on the keyboard, but you only hear the last note. Unison mode is going to sound quite dramatic to standard monophonic, even though the sound itself is still fundamentally monophonic. Can you see that we have this maximum of 8 voices? This is variable between 2 and 16. I'll leave it in 8. What it means is every time I press a single key, you're going to hear 8 variations of that note offset by this amount of detune. So all of those 8 notes are going to be very slightly offset with each other, and you're going to get this wonderful wall of tones. That's 8 different versions of C all playing identically. If I turn detune down to 0, then the effect is going to be significantly diminished. However, there will still be a very slight variance in the oscillators. The oscilloscope won't be completely fixed. Here we go. So you can still see the variance in the wave, but as I turn detune up, it's much more dramatic. If Fabulous way to really easily make really thick sounds. We'll have a look at multi-trigger when we talk about envelopes in the next episode, but I am going to tackle Oscillator 2 sync today. In order to get there, however, we first need to have a look at the glide or portamento section. It's a really unusual implementation of sync in this synthesizer. We need to have a look at this first. So glide is all about how you get from one note to the next. I'm going to turn portamento on, and you can see that both oscillators have portamento engaged. I'll turn oscillator 1 off so that it's easy to hear what's going on. We're just hearing oscillator 2 at the moment, and I'll stick it in regular monophonic mode. So I'm going to play a low C, and then a C 1 octave higher, and you heard the note glide from one note to the next. That is classic portamento. The Synth X, however, had an unusual twist on portamento. If we engage glide instead, you can see that these buttons are mutually exclusive. What we get now is a pitch slope on every single played note. We've basically got an internal glide that triggers every time we press a note. And now the speed is determining how fast each one of those slopes is. The reason I've talked about portamento before we get on to discussing sync is because it's actually going to have a part to play. I'm going to turn it off for the moment and we'll come back here, but just bear in mind what we've learned so far. So what does Oscillator 2 sync mean? Well, as you can see, we're only listening to Oscillator 2 at the moment. I'll just press a simple C, as simple as you like. Or so you might think. I'm going to hold that note down and increase the pitch of Oscillator 2. We'll look on the tuner. No change to the pitch whatsoever. That's because Oscillator 2 is having its pitch determined by Oscillator 1. Oscillator 2 is synced to Oscillator 1. So if I increase the pitch of Oscillator 1 instead, there's our pitch variance. Now you might wonder why on earth you would want to do this. It's because Oscillator Sync's capable of generating a really interesting, unique sound. The best way to demonstrate it is visually. Have a look at what's going on in the oscillator. Okay, there's our simple sawtooth. This is what sync does. Oscillator 2 is now oscillating faster than Oscillator 1. So it draws an entire one of its waves, and then it starts drawing the second wave. You can see here's one entire sawtooth wave, and it starts drawing the second wave. At this point here where my mouse is currently pressing, Oscillator 1 comes along and says, start the generation of your oscillator tone from the beginning. So it snaps back up to the top and begins drawing the wave again. And this shape is what you get with Oscillator Sync. It's a unique effect of analog synthesizers when you're not going to get a wave that looks like that in any other form. And it generates a really interesting classic analog sound. Interestingly, it doesn't matter what I do with Oscillator 1's waveform. The only impact Oscillator 1 is having on Oscillator 2 is this reset function. Where sync really comes in is when you have both oscillators running together, because you get really interesting interplay between those two tones. So that's basic sync. We'll turn Oscillator 1 back off again. Now remember our intro into portamento where we had these little scooped pitch slides. Well, what happens if we introduce portamento on a synced synthesizer? If Oscillator 2 is not in control of its own pitch destiny, but we have these little portamento scoops, that's going to have a tonal impact on the sound. I need to turn Oscillator 1 off because we don't want Oscillator 1 changing its pitch at all, only Oscillator 2. So with glide and Oscillator 2 engaged, now these little scoops are going to have a tonal impact, not a pitched impact. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.